She captured the scene perfectly, because she'd already lived it. Welcome to Tea and Clues. I am your host, Daxon. I'd love to know, where are you listening from today? Share in the comments. You all make this experience richer. Let's begin. It was a dazzling June afternoon in the village of Heatherfield, the kind of day that made even the vicar's ramshackle roses seem in bloom. The clouds had obligingly withdrawn for the occasion, and sunlight filtered down through the beeches. Surrounding the vicarage lawn, where folding chairs creaked under the weight of tweed-clad posteriors, and teacups clinked like gossiping bells, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Rosalind Chudley, presided over the event with the brisk efficiency of a general at war, directing the placement of Victoria sponges and bunting with a waggle of her clipboard. A dozen tables were spread across the grass, covered in linen and weighed down with trifles, jam tarts, and the odd wasp. It was the annual Heatherfield summer fete, and though not officially a competition, it was treated by the villagers with the intensity of the Henley Regatta. Miss Marple sat in a wicker chair near the hydrangeas, sipping weak tea and watching the world through her finely netted hat. Her blue eyes, clouded with age but sharp as ever, moved slowly over the gathering crowd, a tableau of smiles, careful gestures, and the occasional flash of something darker. "Now, dear Jane," said her old friend Dolly Bantry, lowering herself into the chair beside her with a sigh, "I do hope you've brought your knitting. It's the only thing that'll keep us sane through Lady Marchwood's speech." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I never bring my knitting to the fete, Dolly. Too easy to drop a stitch during someone else's scandal." Dolly chuckled. "You're incorrigible." Just then a soft hush spread through the garden like a ripple in tea, and all eyes turned to the gravel path leading up from the main gate. Arriving fashionably late as usual was the guest of honor, Cressida Drake, the enigmatic artist who had taken up residence in Heatherfield only 2 months prior. Tall, angular, and dressed in flowing linen dyed in strange, earthy hues, Cressida carried herself like one of her own portraits, aloof, faintly tragic, and undeniably captivating. She was rumored to have once painted the Prime Minister's dog, though no one quite knew which Prime Minister or which dog. "Odd woman," murmured Dolly, narrowing her eyes. "Says she doesn't believe in sugar or shoes." Miss Marple made no comment. She was watching the way Cressida scanned the lawn, looking for someone. Her smile did not quite reach her eyes. The artist's gaze landed on a younger man standing near the lemonade table, and her shoulders relaxed. He was tall, golden-haired, and absurdly handsome, Julian North, a local solicitor, and if gossip were to be trusted, which it generally was in Heatherfield, Cressida's inspiration. Their relationship was the subject of constant speculation, particularly since Julian was still technically engaged to Miss Harriet Vale, the schoolmistress. "Poor Harriet," whispered Dolly. "Still pretending she's not furious. Look at her, pretending to enjoy cucumber sandwiches." Miss Marple nodded absently. She had noticed something else, the slight flinch in Harriet's left hand as Cressida approached Julian, as if the very nearness of the artist burned her skin. The speeches began, Lady Marchwood droning on about community spirit and rhododendrons, but before they could end, a scream shattered the peace. It came from behind the vicarage, where the artists had been invited to display their paintings in the converted garden shed. A young girl, Millie Blackwell, the vicar's niece, ran across the lawn, skirts flying, pale as a ghost. They said not to go in there," she gasped. "But I saw it, the body. She's dead. Miss Drake's dead." For a moment, the lawn was stunned into silence. Then chairs scraped, teacups clattered, and the crowd surged toward the shed. Miss Marple, still seated, calmly took another sip of her tea. "Curious," she murmured. "I could have sworn she arrived only 20 minutes ago." The news of the murder travelled faster than a wasp toward jam. Within minutes of Millie Blackwell's scream, the carefully assembled garden fete had transformed from a genteel social into a chaos of raised voices and trampled scones. The clinking of teacups gave way to the clatter of hurried feet, and speculation blossomed with the feverish energy of dandelions in spring. Miss Marple, as ever, moved without haste, folding her gloves with care before rising from her wicker chair. She made her way through the thinning crowd, where villagers hovered in tight knots, murmuring in half-horrified, half-thrilled tones. "It's always the artist types," huffed Mr. Elphinstone, the retired headmaster, to anyone who would listen. "Brooding sorts. Introspective. The mind festers when it's too occupied with oils and canvas." Mrs. Ridgway, the butcher's wife and a known romantic, had tears in her eyes. Poor Miss Drake, and right when her portrait of the church spire had been selected for the Autumn Guild's newsletter. "That's not the tragedy, Madge," said her neighbour sharply. "It's what this means for the village. A murder. Here in Heatherfield. A murder in Heatherfield indeed, not an accident. Not a tragic fall or a quiet passing. No, the word on every lip now was murder, and it clung to the air like the scent of scorched pastries. As Miss Marple reached the edge of the garden, she noticed the police had already been summoned. Constable Griggs, young and breathless, was trying, and largely failing, to cordon off the area near the shed. Julian North, face pale and jaw clenched, stood just outside the shed door. He had been the first to enter after Millie's outburst, and now seemed rooted to the spot, hands stiff by his sides. "Julian?" called Harriet Vale as she approached. Her voice was unusually level, but the colour had drained from her face. "Julian, what happened?" He turned to her slowly. "It's her," he said hoarsely. "Cressida. She's dead, stabbed. There was so much blood, Harriet, on her dress, on the canvas." Miss Marple, who had stopped just behind them, tilted her head slightly at that. On the canvas, she thought. By now, Inspector Colin Darnley had arrived, a neat man with prematurely grey hair and the weariness of someone who had grown too accustomed to domestic quarrels and missing garden tools. Murder was rare in Heatherfield, rare enough that his appearance at a crime scene raised eyebrows and expectations in equal measure. "Right," he said, stepping forward. "Everyone, please return to your homes or remain on the vicarage lawn. This is now a crime scene. No one is to enter or leave the premises without clearance. Constable Griggs, take names." Miss Marple remained where she was, her expression mild but her thoughts brisk and sorting. She had known many women like Cressida Drake, talented, magnetic, deeply admired, yet invariably drawing resentment as much as admiration. Women who understood the power of being watched, and how often that provoked envy in those who believed themselves unseen. "Miss Marple," Inspector Darnley greeted her with a nod when he noticed her. He respected her in the way practical men often respected elderly women who knew how to bake, but could also dismantle a suspect's alibi with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. "Hope you'll allow us to handle this one." "Oh, of course." "Inspector," she replied gently, "though you must admit such an unusual setting for violence, our dear vicar's shed—" "I'd hardly call it his shed anymore," muttered Dolly Bantry, who had come up beside her. "It's been taken over by the artistic set. They've got brushes in the toolboxes and light diffusers where the spades used to hang. Still," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "it's a very public location, don't you think? One might wonder why someone would choose such a spot to commit a very private sort of crime." "Desperation, perhaps," offered Dolly. "Or confidence," Miss Marple mused. "The sort that comes with planning." Inside the shed, the body of Cressida Drake had already been photographed and examined. She had collapsed beside an unfinished painting, one that appeared on first glance to be a self-portrait, though the face was only partially completed. The brush was still in her hand. A palette lay tipped beside her, smeared with the deep reds and ochres she had favoured in her recent works. But what stood out to Miss Marple when she later heard of it wasn't the vivid colour or even the canvas, but the way the blood had splashed across the painting. masking parts of it, but not all. Miss Marple didn't need to see it yet. She already knew something was off. If Cressida had been painting herself, how had the blood managed to cover such a precise arc behind her, and only behind her? As though the painting had been positioned differently, perhaps, at the time of death. Evening. Word of the crime had reached every corner of Heatherfield. The high street was alight with whispers. Some said it had been a lover's quarrel, others a jealous rival, and at least one enthusiastic dramatist insisted the killer must have been a travelling stranger. The idea of strangers was always comforting. In its own way, it allowed people to believe the danger had come from outside. At the Rose and Crown, the village pub, the regulars had divided into factions. "It's the solicitor, mark my words," declared Alf Purvis, a farmer with hands like tree roots. "All that time with her, swanning around like some sort of bloody muse." "Don't be daft," countered Nora Edgley, who ran the bakery. "He's a gentleman. It's more likely that Vale woman, the fiancée. She's got ice in her veins, that one." In her sitting room, Miss Marple nursed a warm sherry and listened as Dolly replayed the afternoon's events from her armchair. "You know what I find odd, Jane?" said Dolly, her voice muffled behind a cushion. "Cressida was so particular. She always made a fuss about symmetry. Do you remember that time she refused to hang her painting in the church hall unless the light was exactly balanced on both sides?" "I remember," said Miss Marple quietly. "Well," Milly said when she peeked into the shed, the canvas was turned facing away from the light, and not on the easel. It had been moved onto the floor. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on the stem of her glass. She was painting when she died, supposedly, but not one of the brushes had wet paint. "Isn't that strange?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It's very strange indeed." Dolly looked up. "Do you think it was staged?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the peaceful night of Heatherfield. The vicarage lights still glowed faintly in the distance. "Dolly," she said at last, "did you happen to see who brought the painting easel out from the shed before the fete began?" "No," said Dolly, surprised. "Should I have?" Miss Marple turned back, her eyes distant, focused, and bright as candle flames. "I think someone went to great lengths to paint a very particular picture," she murmured. "But I don't believe it was finished. Not quite." By the following morning, the village of Heatherfield had settled into the peculiar quiet that only follows a storm or a murder. Shopkeepers opened late, and customers lingered longer, their purchases secondary to hushed exchanges about Cressida Drake's untimely end. The usual chimes of the postman's bicycle were replaced by the murmurs of suspicion. Inspector Darnley was already at the vicarage, conducting interviews in the vicar's study, which had been hastily converted into a temporary command post. The scent of linseed oil and violets still hung faintly in the air from where the body had been, and a faint crimson stain remained on the stone path where someone had knelt just moments too late to save the artist. The inspector had taken a no-nonsense approach, calling in those closest to Cressida first. The artist's housekeeper, a young woman named Marnie Keel, sat stiffly in the study's straight-backed chair. She was unpredictable, Marnie admitted, tugging at the cuff of her cardigan. You'd think she was all calm and grace, but if something upset her painting, if someone moved her brushes, or if the lighting wasn't just so, she'd go white with fury. Not loud, never. Just sharp. "And did anyone upset her recently?" the inspector asked, making a note in his small leather-bound book. Marnie hesitated. "She had a fight with Mr. North. I don't know what about exactly. He came to the house late 2 nights ago. I was dusting the hallway and I heard voices. She was angry, more than I'd ever heard before. She said, 'Don't think you can love me in private and abandon me in public.'" Inspector Darnley raised an eyebrow. "And did Mr. North reply?" I don't think he realized I could hear. He said something about Harriet deserving better, and that Cressida had to understand that things couldn't go on as they were. A few minutes later, Julian North was brought in. Still pale, his manner now was more guarded than shaken. "I was fond of Cressida," he said carefully. "But we weren't together. Not officially. There was admiration, of course, and perhaps more than that once. But I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Inspector Darnley studied him. "You were the first person to reach the body, Mr. North. Did you touch anything?" Julian shook his head. "No, I saw the blood and I froze. I think I shouted. Then the others arrived." "And the painting?" the inspector pressed. "It appeared to be a self-portrait. Did she often paint herself?" Julian frowned slightly. "Rarely. Cressida didn't much like mirrors. She preferred to paint others or abstractions of herself. That one must have been recent. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the post office under the pretense of mailing a birthday card to a cousin. But it was never about the card. It was about Miss Letty Nettle, the village's self-appointed archivist and local observer-in-chief. "I suppose you've heard the latest," Letty began, barely waiting for Miss Marple to remove her gloves. "I rarely hear anything first," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "but I generally hear the truth eventually." Letty leaned over the counter, delighted. "Well, Harriet Vale left the vicarage in a state last night, eyes red as poppies and not a word to anyone. And Mrs. Ridgway says she saw her coming out of Cressida's house the day before the fete." "How curious," Miss Marple said, feigning mild surprise. "They weren't particularly friendly, were they?" "Friendly? Oh no, tense, I'd say. Stiff little nods when they passed on the street. But what's more, dear," Letty lowered her voice to a whisper, "someone saw Harriet buying turpentine at Morgan's Hardware, not a week ago." Miss Marple made a soft noise, almost a hum. "She teaches literature, doesn't she? Perhaps she's taken up oil painting." Letty laughed, but Miss Marple's expression remained neutral. She stopped next at the vicarage shed, now cleared of the worst of the aftermath. The police had concluded their scene analysis, and while Inspector Darnley permitted no public access, he did not refuse a polite request from Miss Marple to observe the scene, provided nothing was disturbed. She stepped into the shed, breathing, in the mingled smells of old varnish and something sharp beneath it. The easel stood empty. The painting had been taken as evidence, though a few canvases remained propped against the back wall. One, half covered by a dustcloth, caught her attention. She carefully lifted the cloth. It was a portrait of Harriet Vale. Not precisely flattering, sharp. Cheekbones, lips thin with restraint, eyes averted from the viewer, but unmistakably her. How interesting. Miss Marple turned her head, picturing the scene of the murder. If Cressida had been painting herself, as the evidence suggested, why would a completely different canvas, a finished one, have been moved out from storage before the event? Unless the killer needed a backdrop, or a prop. Back at home she made tea and reviewed what she had quietly collected. Cressida's dramatic personality, her ambiguous entanglement with Julian, Harriet's recent visit to Cressida's home, the turpentine, the portrait. A quarrel, a threat, a reaction. But the heart of it, she knew, would lie not in the loud gestures but in the small, easily dismissed things. That evening, Constable Griggs, still visibly nervous under the weight of real police work, knocked at her door. "Miss Marple," he said, clutching his notebook like a lifeline. "The inspector wonders if you'd mind coming down to look at something." She rose at once, setting aside her mending. In the station, Inspector Darnley met her with a slightly sheepish look. "We've come across something odd. Found in Miss Drake's pocket, a list of names. 5, all from Heatherfield. 3 of. Have them crossed out. Your name was one of them." Miss Marple blinked. "My name?" He handed her the slip. "List. Harriet Vale, Julian North, Miss Marple, Letty Nettlevicker, Chudley, Julian's name, and Letty's were crossed out in dark pencil strokes. So was the vicar's, but Harriet Vale and Miss Marple remained untouched. "What do you make of it?" the inspector asked. Miss Marple stared at the paper for a long moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that Miss Drake was planning a confrontation, or perhaps an exhibition." The inspector frowned. An exhibition? She was painting portraits, wasn't she? Of people she knew, perhaps not all flattering ones. Perhaps she was planning to show them at the fete. "Blackmail?" Darnley asked. "Or revenge?" Miss Marple murmured. There was a long silence. "I should like to see that unfinished painting again," she said at last. "You think it's important?" "I think," she said, her voice soft, "that Miss Drake was painting a story. But someone didn't want that story told." Already formed what he considered a practical working theory. Julian North, emotionally entangled, guilty conscience, first on the scene, had quarrelled with Cressida Drake, lost his temper, and struck. The motive was clear, the opportunity abundant, and the witnesses conveniently vague. A romantic entanglement turned tragic, simple enough for the public, neat enough for the report. Miss Marple, seated just a few pews behind the vicar's lectern during midweek prayers, had other thoughts entirely. She always attended these brief services when a scandal darkened the village. The stillness gave her time to think, and the prayers themselves were often less revealing than the bowed heads around her. People in grief closed their eyes. People in guilt rarely could. Julian North knelt in the front pew, hands clasped tightly, together, back rigid. But he was not weeping, nor staring blankly into space. He was watching the candles, his lips moving slightly as if counting. To Miss Marple he did not look like a man broken by guilt. He looked like a man balancing a heavy secret. After the service, Julian exited quickly, followed a few minutes later by Harriet Vale. She walked with a fixed smile, stopping to speak with the vicar's wife about upcoming school fundraisers. Miss Marple made a note of how composed she appeared, how very controlled. It had always been Harriet's most remarked quality in the village, her remarkable self-possession. A woman who had been disappointed but never foolish, Miss Marple, of course, did not miss the irony. Back at the station, Inspector Darnley compiled statements. Millie Blackwell, the vicar's niece, had once again been interviewed. "I didn't mean to go in," she said. "I was just looking for my sketchbook. I left it in the shed on Saturday during the setup." "And what did you see when you opened the door?" the inspector asked. Millie swallowed. "Miss Drake, she was lying near the easel. Her eyes were open. I thought it was a joke at first. Then I saw the blood." She paused. But the painting looked odd. It was turned toward the far wall. I could only see the back of the canvas. "Odd," the inspector muttered. "So not visible to anyone walking past outside?" "No, sir." Miss Marple was told this by the inspector that same afternoon during what he had come to regard as their informal debriefings. "She was painting her own portrait," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But had it facing the wall. Doesn't make much sense, does it?" "It depends," Miss Marple said lightly, "on whether she truly was painting herself." Darnley blinked. "You don't think it was a self-portrait? Would you paint yourself with your own eyes closed?" she asked. "Because that's what the unfinished canvas shows. The eyes are only partially sketched in and they appear shut." Darnley scratched his head. "I suppose one could use a mirror." "But Cressida disliked mirrors," she added. "That was common knowledge. She rarely even wore cosmetics. And yet someone would have us believe she suddenly felt compelled to paint her likeness, eyes closed, shoulders turned, on fete day no less." The inspector grunted. "You think the painting was staged?" "I think it was swapped," Miss Marple said softly. There was another canvas found in the shed, wasn't there? Behind the supply boxes. Darnley sat up straighter. We assumed it was discarded. I don't believe anything Miss Drake did was casual, she replied. If she painted something and hid it, I suspect it was important. That evening, while the inspector arranged for the hidden canvas to be retrieved, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll through the village, stopping at Rosemead Cottage, where Cressida had lived since her arrival. The front garden was unkempt in an intentional, rather artistic way, wildflowers growing in planned chaos. The windows, however, were spotless, and the blinds were drawn. To her mild surprise, the door was opened not by Marnie Keel, the housekeeper, but by Letty Nettle, who appeared slightly flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple, I was just... Marnie asked me to check the windows for damp. She doesn't like to come in alone since..." "Well?" "How thoughtful of you," Miss Marple said gently. "Was Miss Drake's studio upstairs or down?" Letty blinked. "Down. The back room near the kitchen. She called it the light box, skylights and mirrors everywhere. Not a single curtain." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "What is?" "Oh," she said, eyes twinkling. "Just that a woman who disliked mirrors in life surrounded herself with them in her art." Letty didn't reply. Inside, the studio was indeed bathed in light. Easels stood bare, but canvases leaned against the wall in stacks. Miss Marple gently examined the topmost, mostly landscapes and a few abstract pieces with Cressida's distinctive palette. Warm, aggressive reds, ochres and charcoals, but at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper, she discovered something revealing, another portrait. Unmistakably Julian North, painted with brutal precision, his gaze downward, a frown on his brow, and in the corner the faint shadow of another figure, a woman with red lips and downcast eyes. It was not a flattering depiction. It was an accusation. In oil. She was painting her truths, Miss Marple murmured. Letty shifted nervously. She said the fete would be her opening. She wanted to confront the village with its real selves. How artistic, Miss Marple said, folding the paper gently back over the painting. And dangerous, too. The next morning, as Heatherfield awoke to a fresh mist and the lingering scent of honeysuckle, Inspector Darnley received the retrieved canvas from the shed. It was dust-streaked and spattered, but its content left no doubt, a portrait of Harriet Vale. This time the eyes were open, but the mouth was tight, thin, cruelly so. In her lap lay a torn letter. Behind her, a shadowy figure that looked alarmingly like Julian North. Miss Marple examined it in silence. The detail in the letter was remarkable. Part of a visible line read, "You cannot marry her while I live." She was going to expose Harriet, Darnley murmured. Or perhaps warn her, Miss Marple replied. Sometimes, you see, painting is not only for expression, it's also a record. Darnley leaned back. "You think Harriet found out?" "I think Miss Drake made many enemies," she said, "but the one who killed her had something to lose if the portrait was ever seen." The inspector sighed. "So we have a new suspect." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, "but don't dismiss Julian just yet. Guilty people don't always commit the murder. Sometimes they only provoke it." The days following the murder settled into a strange rhythm in Heatherfield, one foot in the ordinary, the other suspended in unease. Life went on as it must, with church bells, post-deliveries, and cream scones at the tea-room, but a subtle shift had occurred. Conversations grew clipped, eyes lingered longer than they ought, and doors were locked more carefully at night. In her small parlour on Church Lane, Miss Marple was quietly sewing a hem when a knock came at the door. It was Dolly Bantry, out of breath and flushed, her usual cheer muffled by curiosity. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've got." Miss Marple set her sewing aside. "Do come in, Dolly. You look as though you've been galloping across the green." I stopped by Morgan's hardware this morning, Dolly began, dropping into a chair. I wanted new lamp oil, but what do I find instead? Mrs. Morgan chatting away about Harriet Vale, of all people. Oh? Miss Marple poured a cup of tea. Milk, no sugar. Bless you. Yes, apparently Harriet bought a new palette knife. Last Thursday. One of those thin, sharp ones artists use for detail, and she said, this is the curious part, that she needed it for school art demos. But Harriet teaches literature, Miss Marple said, stirring her tea gently. Exactly. Dolly leaned forward. Miss Drake's murder weapon hasn't been found yet, has it? Miss Marple didn't reply at once. Instead, she rose and crossed to the small drawer in her escritoire. From it, she pulled a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of the coroner's report that Inspector Darnley had shared with her the previous afternoon. His idea of a small concession to her unofficial assistance, the cause of death, a single deep stab wound just beneath the collarbone. Angle and depth consistent with a sharp, narrow blade, possibly a long palette knife. The inspector believes the weapon was taken from the scene after the act, Miss Marple said. No fingerprints were found on the brushes or easels. It's as though the killer tidied up afterward. Dolly gave a soft snort. Rather thoughtful of them under the circumstances. Miss Marple smiled faintly but said nothing. Later that afternoon she visited the Heatherfield School, ostensibly to donate a few old novels to the library. The school was a modest building, warm with the smell of chalk and ink. Children's. Artwork hung from the corridor walls, crayon sketches, paper collages, and a rather spirited rendering of the village duck pond. Harriet Vale met her at the office, as crisp and composed as always. She wore a navy cardigan, a silver pin on her lapel, and a polite but guarded smile. Miss Marple, what a kind gesture. Oh, just thinning the shelves a little, Miss Marple replied cheerily. I thought some of the older girls might enjoy Middlemarch. Most likely not, Harriet said dryly, but I'll encourage them. They walked together toward the small reading room. On the way, Miss Marple paused beside a half-finished student mural. Do the children have art instruction here? Only a few periods a term, Harriet said. We don't have a formal instructor. I supervise the basics myself. Ah, said Miss Marple, tilting her head. So you do demonstrate, from time to time? Harriet's smile didn't falter. Yes, occasionally. Miss Marple's eyes landed on a nearby supply cupboard. Its door hung slightly ajar. Inside, atop a stack of sketch pads, lay a small wooden box labeled Blake's Fine Tools, the kind typically used to store professional painting instruments. Children do benefit from proper tools, Miss Marple murmured. They were donated, Harriet replied swiftly. By a parent. I rarely use them. But Miss Marple had already noticed a slim void in the foam casing inside the box, precisely where one palette knife was missing. That evening, Miss Marple relayed her findings to Inspector Darnley, who was growing increasingly grim. She lied. About the tool, he muttered, and she had motive. Jealousy, humiliation, fear of exposure if Cressida revealed the affair. She also had poise, Miss Marple added, which makes her a poor fit for crimes of passion, but a good fit for ones that require calm planning. You think she killed her? I think she had reason, Miss Marple said carefully. But I also think she would have been clever enough to leave no trace at all. Yet she left the painting behind, the one that implicated her. Or rather, she didn't take it. Why? The inspector frowned. Because she didn't know it was there, or because it wasn't meant to be seen, but Miss Drake displayed it. Did she? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You recall the canvas that was turned inward, facing the wall. Who moved it? Who uncovered it? The inspector stared at her. Millie, he said slowly. The vicar's niece. Miss Marple nodded. Miss Drake had many canvases in that shed, she said. Why leave the most scandalous one in plain view, unless she meant to reveal it during the fete? Yet it was hidden, which means someone else turned it around. Perhaps even after the murder. Darnley scribbled a note. You think the scene was rearranged? I think it was curated, Inspector. The next morning, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to the vicarage where Millie Blackwell was tidying up hymnals in the nave. You've been quite brave, Millie, Miss Marple said gently. Witnessing such a terrible thing, Millie flushed. I didn't mean to, I really didn't. Miss Marple nodded, then asked softly, When you found the body, was the light on? Millie blinked. No, it wasn't. The sun was still strong. The door was open, it was bright enough to see. And you say the painting was turned to the wall? Yes. Miss Marple touched her shoulder lightly. And did you tell anyone else about the painting before the police arrived? Millie hesitated. I might have said something to Marnie. She was the first to come when I screamed. Marnie Keel. Millie nodded. She helped me sit down and asked what I'd seen. I said something about a painting. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. And after that? She went inside. Just for a moment. Then came back out and told me to sit quietly and not say another word until the inspector came. Later, in her drawing room, Miss Marple sat with the painting. Once more, Harriet's portrait, now retrieved from the shed and cleaned of blood smears. The torn letter in her lap had not been real, the inspector confirmed. No such letter had been found. It had been part of the painting itself. A fiction, an artistic addition. Not an artifact, which meant Miss Drake wasn't documenting a threat, Miss Marple murmured. She was creating one, framing a story with visual cues. She glanced to the margin of the canvas, where a small signature mark was barely visible, a tiny green flower. Miss Marple sat back, her brow furrowing. That mark didn't belong to Cressida. She'd seen it once before, on a different canvas, during a village exhibit the year before. A student showcase, Millie's showcase. The next morning dawned with the low hush of rain over Heatherfield, casting the village in a dim, reflective mood. Shop windows fogged. Umbrellas bloomed like mushrooms along the narrow streets. The fete. Banners, still hanging limp across the vicarage gate, dripped forlornly into puddles. Inside her tidy sitting room, Miss Marple laid out 2 photographs on the table, both depictions of oil paintings. One was the recovered portrait of Harriet Vale, with the fictional torn letter. The other had been taken from the village student exhibition the previous spring, an event Miss Marple had, as always, attended with quiet attention. Both paintings bore the same distinct signature in the lower corner, a tiny green blossom, not part of the subject but a calling card nonetheless, a mark few would notice. Fewer would understand. She tapped the photos lightly, lips pursed. "Oh, Millie," she murmured, "what did you do?" It wasn't the act of painting itself that unsettled her. No, Millie Blackwell had genuine talent. That much was clear. What troubled Miss Marple was the implication that someone, perhaps Millie herself, had inserted a forged painting into a crime scene, and worse yet, passed it off as Cressida Drake's final work. But why? And who was being protected? At the vicarage, Miss Marple found Reverend Chudley pacing the narrow corridor between the study and the garden. The vicar, though naturally mild-mannered, had not weathered the murder well. He was thinner than usual, with an uncharacteristically deep crease between his brows. "Miss Marple," he said, startled. "Oh, forgive me, I was lost in thought. There's tea if you'd like." "I won't stay long," she said, offering him a warm smile. "Just hoping to speak to Millie. Is she about?" He hesitated. "She's been quite upset, poor thing. Not sleeping. Marnie's taken to watching over her like a hawk. That is generous of Marnie," Miss Marple said gently. Given her own grief for Miss Drake. Yes, he said absently. Strange, that bond. They had such different temperaments. Indeed, Miss Marple said. May I see Milly? She was led upstairs, where Milly sat cross-legged on her bed, an open sketchbook in her lap. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, and for the first time something flickered in her eyes. Not just sadness, but apprehension. Hello, Miss Marple. Hello, dear. May I sit? Milly nodded and moved aside. I've always thought artistic people feel things more keenly, Miss Marple began, watching the girl closely. Wouldn't you agree? Milly looked down at her sketchbook. A soft pencil was poised over a half-drawn hand. Maybe. Miss Drake, for instance. Very passionate, very precise. She didn't like surprises. She hated them, Milly said quietly. But she liked to challenge people, Miss Marple said. With her paintings, with what she saw. Milly was silent. Do you remember the student exhibition last year? Miss Marple continued. You had two pieces displayed, one of the market square, the other a portrait of a friend. I believe you called it Girl in the Garden. Milly blinked. Yes. There was a mark on both, a small green flower hidden in the corner, like a signature. Milly's voice was barely audible. It's mine. I saw the same mark on the painting found beside Miss Drake, Miss Marple said gently. The one everyone believes she was working on when she died. Milly's hands trembled slightly. I didn't mean to lie, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know she'd be dead. I didn't know. Miss Marple waited. Milly took a deep breath. The painting wasn't hers. It was mine. I forged it. Well, not forged exactly. I copied her style. I painted it last week, as a gift. She said she might use it in her next show. She thought it was bold. I left it in the shed before the fete behind the boxes. She said she'd decide whether it was worthy of unveiling. Miss Marple nodded. And after you found the body? I told Marnie what I saw. I was shaking. She went into the shed. When she came back, she told me to be quiet, not to speak to anyone until the police arrived. She went inside alone? Yes. Miss Marple nodded again. Did she bring anything out with her? Milly frowned. Just her coat, I think. No painting. Milly blinked. No. Wait. There was something in her arms. I thought it was her coat at the time. But it could have been another painting, Miss Marple finished softly. At Rosemead Cottage, Miss Marple found Marnie Keel dusting the mantel. She smiled tightly when she saw her guest. Miss Marple, to what do I owe? Just a brief word, dear, Miss Marple said cheerily. I do so admire how you've kept this place tidy. Marnie's expression remained unreadable. It's not my home, but someone must look after it. Miss Marple moved toward the window, glancing idly at the light. Milly told me you were the first person to enter the shed after the body was discovered. Marnie froze just for a fraction of a second. She was in shock, Marnie said. I went in to make sure, to check. And you found the painting? It was already there. Miss Marple turned to her, eyes steady. Only it wasn't. The painting in question wasn't Cressida's. It was Milly's. A long pause. That doesn't mean anything. Oh, but it does, because Cressida Drake never painted herself with her eyes closed, never softened her jaw, never posed herself as passive. That wasn't her style. The portrait beside her body was gentle, tentative, too modest. It was a clever imitation, but not hers. Marnie's hands balled into fists at her sides. She didn't deserve what they did to her, she hissed. Who, dear? They laughed at her, Marnie snapped. Behind her back, Julian, Harriet, all of them. They admired her when she was mysterious and wild and difficult. But when she wanted more, when she tried to make a place for herself here, they resented it. Miss Marple stepped closer. So you tried to protect her reputation, she said quietly. Tried to spare her the indignity of being known for what? Spite? Revenge? That portrait of Harriet, she painted it in anger. She was going to hang it at the fete, Marnie whispered. Expose them. I told her it was cruel, that it would only make things worse. But she said people needed to see. That truth wasn't meant to be kind. You took it away, Miss Marple said softly, after you found her, replaced it with Millie's work. Marnie turned away, lips trembling. I didn't kill her. I believe you, Miss Marple said gently. But protecting the dead doesn't always protect the living. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cozy parlour as rain clattered gently on the panes. The fire crackled. Her tea steamed beside her, but her mind was far from settled. There was one secret left unspoken, one motive unaccounted for, and one person, so very close to the truth, who had yet to be tested. She gazed into the hearth. Paintings, she said aloud, aren't meant to be admired. They're meant to provoke, and someone couldn't bear to be seen for who they really were. The storm passed overnight, leaving Heatherfield freshly scrubbed and glistening in the morning sun. Birds chirped a bit too cheerily, and the village green was already filling with dog walkers, gardeners, and cautious conversation. But the calm was deceptive. At the Heatherfield police station, Inspector Darnley sat with a stack of statements and a very grim expression. Marnie Keel's confession, though not to the murder, had complicated the narrative considerably. Her swapping of the paintings, her emotional loyalty to Miss Drake, and her veiled bitterness toward Julian North and Harriet Vale cast new light on every prior assumption. Marnie's actions obscured the real timeline, he said, pushing a file across to Miss Marple, who sat primly opposite him. We believe the painting found with the body was Miss Drake's. It wasn't. We thought it represented her final moments. It didn't. The original, presumably the one of Harriet, was taken, and now we have no idea what Miss Drake was actually doing in the shed before she was killed. Miss Marple sipped her tea. And yet we know precisely what she was intending to do. That's often far more revealing. Darnley raised an eyebrow. You still believe she was staging a confrontation? Miss Marple nodded. She wanted to reveal the truth about someone, perhaps several someones. Her method wasn't kind, but it was consistent. Each of her recent paintings, particularly the portraits, had an unflinching clarity. She painted flaws, Inspector, that was her style. Emotional X-rays, Darnley frowned. You think the killer saw the painting, panicked and struck? Miss Marple folded her hands. That's one possibility, but I believe the killer had something to hide, a truth Cressida was prepared to reveal, something so devastating, so damaging, that it was worth silencing her for good. He leaned back. We've been circling Julian and Harriet for days, but I'm not convinced either of them had the coldness this would require. Planning, clean-up, manipulation of evidence. That feels, he trailed off, like someone with experience, Miss Marple said, finishing his thought. Someone methodical, someone who understands the performance of emotion, not just the feeling of it. Darnley gave a slow nod. Someone like Harriet Vale. That afternoon, Miss Marple made an unannounced visit to the school. Classes were in session, the low murmur of students reciting poetry drifting down the halls. A faint chalk dust scent lingered in the air, mingling with something sharper, turpentine or linseed. Harriet Vale greeted her with a calm smile. Miss Marple, twice in 1 week, is there news? In a manner of speaking, Miss Marple replied, her tone pleasant. I wanted to talk about art. Harriet raised a brow. Art? I've been thinking about what it means to paint someone, Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. To capture them, truly. You see, Miss Drake had a gift for that. She saw beneath surface pleasantries. Harriet said nothing. She painted you, didn't she? Miss Marple continued. A private commission? Or perhaps just one of her unsanctioned projects? Harriet's face remained composed. She offered once, I declined. Did you? Miss Marple asked mildly. Yet there exists a painting of you, quite detailed. She painted it from memory, perhaps. I wouldn't know. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer. It's an unflattering piece, but what makes it most interesting is the inclusion of a letter, a fabricated one, torn, dramatic, reading, "You cannot marry her while I live." Harriet's lips thinned. Miss Drake had a flair for melodrama, but also for truth, Miss Marple said quietly. Tell me, Miss Vale, did you write such a letter to Julian? Harriet's eyes flickered, the first real crack. No. Miss Marple gave her a gentle, grandmotherly smile. Then perhaps you said it. For the first time, Harriet stood straighter, her chin lifting a fraction. She was cruel, she said, voice low. She thought pain was beautiful. She delighted in exposing people. And she wasn't content to have Julian. She needed me to see it, to humiliate me. Julian swore the affair was over. Harriet gave a soft laugh, utterly without humor. Julian swears what's convenient. That doesn't mean he won't go crawling back when he's lonely or bored. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. So you were angry? Of course, I was angry, Harriet snapped, but I didn't kill her. There was a silence between them, taut and strange. Miss Marple tilted her head. May I ask, where were you during the hour before the fete? I was setting up in the schoolroom, checking decorations. I was seen by at least 3 students. And you never entered the shed? No. Miss Marple's voice was like a thread pulled through a needle. But you own a palette knife. You purchased it from Morgan's Hardware. Harriet blinked. Yes, for the school supplies. It's in the art cupboard. Actually, Miss Marple said softly, it isn't. The slot for it is empty. For a moment the room stilled. Then Harriet said quietly, it was stolen. Miss Marple nodded. By whom, I wonder? That evening, Inspector Darnley received word that the original Harriet portrait had been recovered. It had been wrapped in oilskin and buried in a trunk in the vicarage's attic, beneath old choir robes and theatre props. Marnie, it seemed, had only hidden the replacement. Someone else had made the real painting disappear, and that someone had keys to the vicarage. Miss Marple held the recovered painting under lamplight. This version was far more severe. Eyes narrowed, lips pursed, the background a swirl of red and black. No letter. Just a title scrawled across the bottom, in the same tight script Cressida used in all her works. The promise, sir. What promise? Inspector Darnley asked. Miss Marple answered without hesitation. To keep a secret. The final twist came late. That night, the vicar's housekeeper, an elderly woman named Agnes Perrow, appeared at Miss Marple's doorstep just after 11, soaked to the skin and visibly shaking. I couldn't keep it any longer, she whispered. Miss Marple drew her in gently. What is it, Agnes? I found something the day after the fete, Agnes said, pulling a cloth-wrapped bundle from under her cloak. It was behind the sideboard in the garden shed. I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid. Inside the bundle was a long, thin palette knife, blood-stained. By morning the weapon had been confirmed, the same blade used to kill Cressida Drake, and there was a partial fingerprint on the handle. It belonged to Julian North. When confronted, Julian went pale but didn't faint or protest. Instead, he sagged in the chair at the station and covered his face. It was an accident, he said hoarsely. I went to speak to her, to beg her not to display the portrait. I told her it would ruin Harriet. She laughed, said Harriet had ruined herself, said she wanted to show everyone the truth. I lost control. You brought the knife, Darnley said quietly. I thought I could scare her. Cut the canvas, make the problem go away, but she fought me. We struggled, she fell. And you staged the scene. Yes, Julian whispered. I took the painting, hers, and hid it. I found another canvas, one that looked like her work. I thought if people believed it was a self-portrait, they'd think it was suicide. But it looked wrong. I panicked. Miss Marple, standing just beyond the doorway, said nothing. She simply observed. Later, walking home, she murmured to herself, "Truth painted over truth, but paint, like guilt, always finds a way to bleed through." Though Julian North's confession had stunned the village, Heatherfield's usual appetite for closure remained curiously unsatisfied. There was no triumphant pronouncement, no theatrical arrest in the high street, no public trial. Of tears and remorse, Julian had not tried to flee, he had not pleaded innocence. Instead, he had offered a broken account of a moment lost to rage and fear. And yet something about the way he said it, even to Inspector Darnley, still left an echo of uncertainty. Miss Marple knew it too. She knew that guilt was a shadow with many angles. Sometimes it followed the murderer, sometimes it dogged the witness, and sometimes, in its most cunning form, it clung to the wrong person entirely, so subtly that even the guilty man began to believe he was to blame. Miss Marple sat with her teacup in hand, gazing into the hearth where flames flickered softly. She was not convinced. It wasn't the emotion in Julian's voice, or even the confession itself. It was the painting, the portrait of Harriet, titled The Promise. Cressida had not been painting betrayal. She had been painting secrecy, a withheld truth, a hidden loyalty. That was no murder motive. That was leverage, and leverage, Miss Marple knew, only mattered to those who feared exposure. So then why had Julian removed the painting? What secret had he feared more than the truth of an affair? She turned the thought over carefully. Unless it wasn't his secret at all. 2 days later, Miss Marple asked Inspector Darnley to delay the formal charges. "I know he confessed," she said gently, "but I believe he was manipulated. Someone set the scene, yes, but I don't believe it was Julian who killed Miss Drake." Darnley sighed. "Then why confess?" "Because he believes he did it. Because he's been convinced of it." She gave him a steady look. "Would you allow me one last conversation? I'd like to invite someone to tea." Darnley, weary but now used to Miss Marple's quiet certainty, gave a reluctant nod. 1 hour. The guest arrived punctually. Harriet Vale, dressed in dark grey, her lips unpainted, her manner impeccable as always. Miss Marple welcomed her in with warmth and offered a plate of cherry scones. "Thank you," Harriet said, "though I must say I wasn't expecting a tea invitation at such a time." "Nor was I," Miss Marple said, pouring. "But so much has happened, and I thought it only decent to offer a moment of clarity." Harriet blinked. "Clarity?" "You see," Miss Marple continued, "I've always found murder is rarely about hatred. It's often about fear. The fear of loss, of exposure, of shame." Harriet stiffened. "Is this about Julian?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, and no. Tell me, Harriet, have you ever painted?" Harriet looked startled. "No. Never held a brush?" "Not since school." "Ah, then you wouldn't have recognized, for instance, a forged Cressida Drake painting." Harriet was silent. Miss Marple took a small envelope from the side table and opened it. Inside was a photograph, not of the painting, but of the back of the canvas. Upon it, in faint pencil, was written, "Study 4, Millie, do not show, not finished." Miss Marple placed the photograph on the table between them. "This," she said, "was the painting found at the crime scene, the one Julian claimed was hers. The one Marnie replaced." Harriet's eyes flicked to it. "I don't understand." Miss Marple's voice was as soft as ever. "Then allow me to explain. Cressida did not die while painting. She died while arguing. The portrait you feared, yours, was intended to be unveiled that day, but it never was." Harriet looked away. "I believe you went to the shed that morning," Miss Marple continued. "Perhaps to plead with her, to warn her. Perhaps even to threaten. And something happened." Harriet didn't speak, Miss Marple folded her hands. "Do you know what Julian said when he confessed? He said, 'I thought I could scare her.' Cut the canvas. That's not the voice of a man prepared to kill. That's the voice of someone sent, someone manipulated." Harriet's hands trembled slightly. "You told him she was going to expose you," Miss Marple said quietly. "Told him she was vindictive, dangerous. You made him believe she was painting poison, that she would ruin you both. You sent him there, knowing he might try to stop her, knowing it could escalate." "No," Harriet said suddenly, her voice hard. "I didn't send him. I tried to stop it." Miss Marple waited. Harriet's face broke just slightly. "I begged him," she said hoarsely. "I told him not to go, but he insisted, said he had to make it right." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Because he believed it was his fault she was hurt." "I told her to stop," Harriet whispered. "I went to the shed that morning. She laughed at me, said she'd hang the portrait anyway. Said people needed to see the truth. She called it art. I called it cruelty. What did you do? I tried to take it. She grabbed my arm. She slapped me. I shoved her. She fell." Her voice broke. She hit the edge of the easel. Miss Marple's breath caught, though she betrayed nothing on her face. Harriet continued, now shaking. "I didn't mean to. I didn't think she was... She just stopped moving. There was so much blood. I ran." Miss Marple placed her hand gently over Harriet's. "You moved the knife? I couldn't leave it. I knew how it would look. And Julian? I didn't mean to let him take the blame. But when he found her, he thought, oh God, he thought it was him. I told him not to speak, but I didn't stop him when he confessed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said, "and I believe it's time to tell the inspector." Half an hour later, Miss Marple sat once more with Inspector Darnley. "She pushed her," Darnley said slowly. "An accident. But then the knife, the manipulation, the silence, that changes things." "She didn't mean to kill her," Miss Marple said, "but the concealment afterward, the way she let Julian believe it was his fault, that was intentional." The inspector rubbed his temples. "That'll be a hard case, no witnesses, no forensics. Just confession and character." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Sometimes, Inspector, character is the most conclusive evidence of all." That evening, as the sun set behind the spire of St. Cuthbert's, the village of Heatherfield exhaled a collective breath. Julian North was released under caution, pending further investigation. Harriet Vale, dignified to the last, returned home with barely a ripple in her composure. No charges were laid. Not yet. But whispers grew louder, and soon Harriet quietly resigned from the school. She moved away 3 weeks later. Millie's art, once hidden in corners, was now proudly displayed in the village hall. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her rose garden, her teacups, and her embroidery. But those who knew her best noted that her stitches grew tighter when there was blood in the soil. It was not long after Harriet Vale's quiet departure that Heatherfield settled into a sort of uneasy equilibrium, as if the village had agreed, by unspoken consensus, that it was best to let the whole ugly affair slip gently into history. The fete had been cancelled indefinitely. The vicar's shed was padlocked, and people no longer spoke of Cressida Drake in public with the admiration they once had. She had become a cautionary tale of genius too sharp, too confrontational, too knowing for a place like Heatherfield. But Miss Marple did not forget. Nor did she believe the case was truly closed, because although Harriet had confessed tearfully, bitterly, to pushing Cressida in a moment of passion and fear, and though Julian had withdrawn his own confession with visible relief, something still didn't fit. Miss Marple had not forgotten Marnie Keel, nor the missing 15 minutes between the time Millie Blackwell raised the alarm and when the police were called, nor the fact that Marnie had been alone with the body during that interval, nor The painting, the one swapped, not destroyed, replaced with a copy of a self-portrait. A delicate deception not born of panic, but of intention. No, the accident, if it had been an accident, had not ended the story. Someone else had finished it, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. It was a rainy Thursday when Miss Marple once again returned to Rosemead Cottage. The windows were still clean, but there was a hush about the place, something unnatural in the way the wind whispered through the ivy outside, and how the front door opened not at once, but after a full half-minute, as if its occupant had been weighing the wisdom of answering. Marnie stood in the doorway, eyes wary. Miss Marple. "Good afternoon, dear," said Miss Marple with her usual gentle tone. "I've brought back your embroidery thread. I used the green, you see. Such a lovely shade. Like spring moss." Marnie hesitated, then stepped back, allowing her in. "Thank you." "You." Miss Marple stepped inside. The air was dry, tinged with the faintest smell of turpentine. She looked around slowly. "You've kept the place just as she left it." Marnie nodded, lips pressed tight. She was very particular about her space, wasn't she? She didn't like change. Miss Marple set the embroidery kit on the table, then paused, her voice soft. "Tell me, Marnie, what happened in those 15 minutes after Millie ran from the shed?" Marnie froze. "You told Millie to sit still, to say nothing. Then you went inside, alone. What did you do?" I checked on her." "She was dead," said Miss Marple. "You saw the blood. The blow was fatal." Marnie said nothing. Miss Marple pressed gently. "And you saw the painting, didn't you? The portrait of Harriet." Marnie's voice was almost a whisper. "Yes." "What did you think when you saw it?" "She was going to ruin her," Marnie said. "But more than that. She was going to humiliate her. Harriet Vale, so careful, so respected. And for what? Because she loved a man who couldn't say no." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You knew it would hurt Harriet." "She wanted to hurt her," Marnie snapped. "Cressida knew exactly what she was doing, and when I saw her lying there, dead, I thought, this is it. This is how she'll be remembered, as spiteful, as cruel, and I couldn't let that be her legacy. So you removed the painting." Marnie nodded and replaced it. "I knew Millie had been working on a portrait," Marnie said quietly. "A soft one, a gentle one. She'd left it in the shed. I found it and propped it up beside the body. It wasn't perfect, but it made her seem peaceful, like she died while doing something beautiful." Miss Marple regarded her with grave kindness. "But she didn't die peacefully. She was struck, she fell, and someone added the final wound." Marnie flinched. "The coroner said the fatal injury came from a blade," Miss Marple continued. "A clean wound, not consistent with a fall. The injury Harriet described, hitting the easel, would have caused blunt trauma, perhaps a concussion, but not the precise deep stab the autopsy revealed." Marnie's voice dropped to a whisper. "No, that wasn't from the fall. Miss..." Marple stood very still. "You stabbed her." Marnie didn't deny it. She simply sank into the armchair, her expression blank. "I thought she was still breathing," she said after a moment. "She twitched, groaned, and I thought, what if she did wake up? What if she told them what happened? They'd arrest Harriet. She'd go to prison. For a mistake." "So you made sure she wouldn't wake up?" Marnie said nothing. "And then," Miss Marple added gently, "you finished the scene. Moved the portrait, hid the real one, wiped the brush handles. You made it look like an accident, or perhaps like something else entirely." "It was all so fast," Marnie said. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I wanted her to be remembered differently." Miss Marple sighed. "But people aren't remembered for the paintings we leave behind. They're remembered by the people who survive them. There was silence between them, and in that silence the weight of truth settled. Inspector Darnley was grim when he heard the full account. So Harriet's push didn't kill her. No, Miss Marple confirmed. Cressida was alive, injured, unconscious perhaps, but still alive when Marnie found her. It was Marnie who delivered the fatal blow, with the palette knife, to protect Harriet. And then she constructed the entire scene to control the narrative. She forged the story, quite literally, with a brushstroke. And Harriet believed she had done it, and lived with the guilt. Until she couldn't bear it, Darnley finished. Miss Marple nodded. Marnie allowed that guilt to fester. Because it gave her a reason not to feel like a murderer. Darnley rubbed his jaw. I can't say I've ever had a case solved through an embroidery return, Miss Marple smiled faintly. It's all about patterns, Inspector, whether in thread or people. Marnie Keel was arrested quietly. She did not resist. Her confession was delivered with calm precision, and when asked why she hadn't simply called for help instead of intervening, she said, I didn't trust the world to understand her, so I thought I could shape her memory into something cleaner. In the end, Heatherfield was left with no simple villain, no tidy fable, just grief, layered with motive and mistake. A death that began with a shove, but ended with a decision, a choice to finish what accident had only started. Miss Marple, back in her cottage, watched the wind stir the roses outside. The scandal would fade, of course. The gossip would dry up. Eventually people would forget who painted what and why. But she would remember, because beneath the surface of every village, every tidy home and every polite smile, there were always unfinished portraits. And in time, every one of them would be revealed. As the summer waned and the scent of lavender drifted once more through the hedgerows, Heatherfield resumed its quiet rhythm, but a subtle weight hung in the air, a lingering residue of tragedy. Though the police matter was settled, and Marnie Keel awaited her hearing at the county jail, no one truly spoke of it. The vicar's shed had been emptied and locked for good. The fete committee disbanded without ceremony, and the villagers, always eager to heal, now did so with cautious civility, as if one careless word might crack the delicate surface of their returned peace. Miss Marple, ever the observer of life's gentle shifts, sat beneath her climbing roses, with a fresh pot of tea and her embroidery basket at her side. But the project in her hands had remained unfinished for days. Her needle hovered often just above the canvas, unmoving, as her mind returned again and again to one stubborn thought. That refused to lie flat. Why did Cressida paint that final portrait? She had no reason to threaten Harriet, no leverage to gain. The supposed exposure was thin, more symbolic than scandalous. There was no crime hidden in Harriet's life, no fraud, no infidelity beyond what was already assumed, and Julian, for all his poetic fumbling and weakness of spine, was no villain. Cressida had painted the promise with intent. It was titled, it was finished, it was planted, and it was meant to be seen. Miss Marple set her teacup down. What if the painting wasn't about Harriet, the promise to keep a secret? But not Harriet's, not Julian's, someone else's entirely. She fetched her notebook and turned to the page where she'd scribbled the names from the note Cressida had carried before her death, the one found folded in her pocket. Harriet Vale, Julian North, Miss Marple, Letty Nettle, Vicar Chudley. 3 names were crossed out. Hers was not. Nor was Harriet's, and not one person had ever asked why Letty Nettle's name had been on the list to begin with. Miss Marple rose, slipped into her cardigan, and set out for the post office. It was nearly closing time, and Letty was sweeping the floor when the door creaked open. She looked up, startled, then gave a sheepish smile. "Oh, Jane, just tidying. Place has been dusty all week with the damp." Miss Marple returned the smile with gentle warmth. "You've kept busy, I'm sure. A scandal like this tends to disrupt routine." Letty made a vague sound. It's been dreadful, though I suppose things are quieter now. I wonder, Letty, Miss Marple said, her tone entirely pleasant. Did you know Marnie well? Before Cressida arrived, Letty's brow furrowed slightly. Marnie, not especially, just through the church. She said once, some weeks ago, that you were one of the few people Cressida truly spoke to, that you'd been helping with. Records. Notes for a memoir, perhaps. Letty's mouth opened, then closed again. She was very curious about the village's past, Miss Marple went on. You've always had an impeccable memory for details. Did she ask you about anyone in particular? Letty glanced toward the window. She wanted to know about family lines, she said slowly. The old families. Who came from where? She said it was for a painting series, but she asked odd questions about church records, baptisms, adoptions. Miss Marple nodded. She was researching someone. Letty looked back at her, and the air between them grew still. She never said who. No, Miss Marple said softly, because it was someone she couldn't name aloud. Not yet. Letty licked her lips. Jane, what are you suggesting? Miss Marple held her gaze. I think Marnie Keel was her daughter. The words dropped like a stone in water. No splash, just ripples that moved outward, touching every corner of the room. Letty stared. That's not possible. Marnie. She was brought here as a child, after her aunt died. Yes, Miss Marple said, but no one ever questioned whose child she was. She came from London, quiet, clever, withdrawn, and then Cressida arrived years later and took her in not as a servant, but as a companion. She tutored her, taught her painting, shared everything with her. She never treated her as a child. In her employ, Letty's voice cracked. She never said anything. Because she promised she wouldn't, Miss Marple said. That was the promise, a pact between them. Marnie wouldn't speak, and Cressida wouldn't claim her. Not publicly, not in a village like this. Letty sank onto the stool behind the counter. I always thought there was something in the way she looked at her, something fierce, not like a mistress, like a mother bird. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. And when she died, when Marnie thought Harriet was to blame, she took revenge. The only way she knew how, by shaping the scene, shifting the blame, protecting what legacy remained. Letty looked up, her voice barely audible. Why are you telling me this now? Miss Marple gave her the kindest of smiles. Because I think you already knew, and because you were her friend, and the story shouldn't end in silence. Outside, the bells of St. Cuthbert's began to chime the hour. Miss Marple rose to her feet, drawing her shawl closer. I shall write to the inspector, she said. Marnie's confession won't change. But the court may wish to know the truth of her motive. Letty nodded, her eyes shining. Do you think it will help? She killed in grief, not hatred, Miss Marple said gently. That may not absolve her, but it matters. And more than that, people should know. Cressida Drake loved someone once. She was not just difficult and proud. She was a mother. Letty pressed a hand to her chest. Miss Marple reached the door, then paused. And Letty, she said, turning back, do tell the vicar to check the parish birth ledgers. There's a gap in the 1908 London entries. I expect it was inked out. With that she stepped into the fading light of the lane, the wind tugging gently at her scarf. And at last, the mystery settled, not with a dramatic arrest or scandalous trial, but with a quiet truth, buried like so many others beneath years of propriety and fear. In Heatherfield, as everywhere, the past did not always stay hidden, but if one listened closely, it could still be understood. Miss Marple walked on. The roses in her garden would be blooming again soon. The days turned cooler in Heatherfield, as the hedgerows gave up their last wild blooms, and the sky softened into autumn. The events of the summer, though never truly forgotten, were gradually folded into the fabric of village memory, discussed only in murmurs or with quiet nods when passing Rosemead Cottage, which now stood shuttered and still. Marnie Keel awaited her trial at the county court. The charge of manslaughter, rather than murder, had been settled upon, in part due to Miss Marple's careful advocacy and the poignant revelation of Cressida Drake's long-held secret. No scandal exploded in the press. No lurid headlines filled the post office window. Heatherfield had always preferred its tragedies small and contained, like pressed violets between the pages of an old Bible. But to those who had known Cressida, or believed they had, something had shifted. Her memory was no longer tied to vanity or strangeness, but to complexity, to grief and love, pride and pain. As Miss Marple had observed to the vicar one afternoon, "People rarely show you all their truths, Reverend, especially the ones they've been punished for." The vicar had nodded, though he seemed unsure whether he was meant to agree or reflect, in silence. Miss Marple herself did not gloat over the case's resolution. She never did. There had been no victory in the solving, only understanding. The painting, The Promise, had been returned quietly to Millie Blackwell, with the suggestion that she choose what to do with it in time. She had not decided yet. Some things, she said, were still too raw to frame. Julian North had moved away shortly after the final inquiry was closed, though not in disgrace. He left without fanfare, a quiet man with a deep sadness around his eyes, the kind one carries after realizing how much harm can come from trying too hard to be kind. Harriet Vale's name faded from conversation. Some said she had returned to London, others that she had taken a post in the north. She sent no word. Letty Nettle remained ever attentive at the post office, her gossip a shade more cautious, her tone less sure of the boundaries between truth and tale. And though she never spoke of it, she kept a copy of the parish register in a locked drawer, one where a missing name had once been covered in smudged ink, and now, in her hand, was written gently beside it, Marnie Drake, born March 9th, 1908 in her cottage on Church Lane. Miss Marple returned to her sewing and her tea, her quiet reading and her thoughtful walks. From time to time she would pause at the church gate and glance at the vicarage garden, where the grass had grown tall over the place the fete tables had once stood. One afternoon, Dolly Bantry joined her there. "They'll be planning a Christmas pageant soon," Dolly said, wrapping her shawl tightly. "Children in halos and tea lights in the pews. Life marches on." Miss Marple smiled, her hands folded. "It always does." Dolly glanced sideways. "You don't seem entirely pleased with that thought." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Then, no, I am. It's only that we so often pretend life is simple when really it's full of hidden corners, secrets, half-finished portraits. Most people paint themselves one way, but the truth, well, that tends to bleed through if you look long enough." Dolly chuckled softly. "That's rather profound, Jane." Miss Marple offered a modest shrug. "It's only observation, dear." And as they stood there, the bell of St. Cuthbert's began to chime the hour once more. The roses would return in the spring. So would the fete. And someone, inevitably, would be found whispering beneath the old beech tree about the summer at E. Painter died in the garden shed, but for now the village was at peace, and Miss Marple, her eyes bright and still watchful, returned home to her needles and her mysteries. There would always be another secret, another quiet crime, tucked between the teacups, and she would be ready.